Welcome to BRI Dialogues. We are July 16, 2026. Interesting times we live in. The dynamics in and around Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, ECC, and the Belt and Road initiatives, traverses in and around West Asia are all subjects that will affect all of us. Today we have on the program Neil Quilliam, Managing Director at Azour Strategy, who is an associate fellow at the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. And Neil previously held senior roles at Chatham House, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, Control Risks, and the United Nations University. And above all, he's an alumni from Durham University. So Neil and Anoush go a long way back. Neil, welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I think we should start in and around Persian Gulf. And I wanted to start a bit at the 40,000 feet with a question that has two angles to it. One is that has United States, through these operations of, Midnight Hammer, Epic Fury, started something that inadvertently accelerated Beijing's Belt and Road ambitions and permanent repricing, one would say, of geopolitical risk attached to the Gulf itself. Is that changing because of these things? So is the Persian Gulf looking at that, oh, all of these investments, $2.5 trillion in armaments, security umbrella with the United States, and then you have the largest buyer of oil and gas, which is China. Has America, like many of the faux pas in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places, unintentionally given a stronger hand to Beijing through these actions?
I think over the long term, the answer is yes. In the immediate term, no. The constant set of messages that I hear, that I receive, certainly from the Gulf Arab states, is we have to double down on our relationship with the US. This is a phrase we hear repeatedly: double down, double down. But it's sort of said through almost through gritted teeth. It's because for the time being there is no alternative. But in terms of wanting to diversify their partnerships, their relationships, economic defense, this has certainly given that process a fillip. This is not new, of course. One can go back to sort of Obama's pivot to Asia as being a turning point in which the Gulf Arab states started to reassess their relationship with the US. And at the time, the question was, this sort of cyclical in terms of election cycles, or is this structural? I mean, I think the players in the Gulf have now come to the conclusion, this is structural. This is a structural change. So in the short term, I do think we'll see a doubling down on that relationship with the US. And very interestingly, I've been in a number of workshops the past few days in Chatham House under the Chatham House rule. So I can't tell you about who was there, but I can tell you what was said. What was very interesting for me was that from a number of the people around the table, they were stressing how Gulf leaders are requesting more defense support, more security support from the Americans at the moment. So in a way, I think short term, this has probably intensified the US relationship in the Gulf, but long term, it's accelerated that push away from the US. I wouldn't say necessarily into the hands of China, but certainly Asia is very much the future for the Middle East and for the Gulf, and China is clearly a key part in that.
Dr. Q, lovely to have you with us. It's nice to see you in this capacity as well, interacting with me and Ali. Uh, Neil, that said, I think it's the first time in modern history of this region where security is being provided by one pole and economic by the other. There was a long time that, of course, there was then European American competition for markets in the GCC countries. Now they're all led by China. So, how long can this discrepancy, if you like, this structural problem remain? Will China, from the perspective of the guys that you talk to all the time, the elites and so on, that will China ever come to our aid in the way that the Americans do? Americans get a lot of things wrong. They recognize that, of course.
Mm.
The Iraq War was one, this is another one, and so on. But are they conscious of the structural tension between where their economic interests lie and where the security is provided, particularly when you get into a hot crisis as this one? And if they do think about it, do they just wish it to go away, or do they actually actively pursue a strategy that can address this really quite stark tension?
I mean, yes, they recognize it. Yes, they're in the hot seat. They very much feel this. I'm not sure that they feel that they have the agency
Hmm.
to do a lot about it at the moment. I'm always reminded of Sir Tom Phillips, who was his last role in the FCDO was as British ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and this was a good more than a decade ago. Actually, when we were putting that book together with with Nottingham, when we had those series of workshops, I remember he said, he'd accompanied a Saudi delegation, senior Saudi delegation to Beijing. And at the time, so this was probably 2013, 2014, he said what was very clear from him was that the Saudis wanted to have a much stronger strategic, thicker relationship with the Chinese. But at the time in Beijing, this was its expression. Beijing basically saw, the region, the Gulf, as a gas station,
Hmm.
or saw that in terms of relations, and partly in part of the chapter I had in that book, I described this relationship as being very transactional.
Hmm.
Um, but from the Gulf Arab side, wanting to deepen that, wanting to thicken that, and to make that more strategic. And I see us where we've moved along
Hmm.
on that journey. And what I see a lot now when I go to the Gulf, it's very clear there is a growing presence, a growing Chinese
Hmm.
presence in the region. Constant delegations passing through, lots of different, not just businesses, but lots of young Chinese researchers coming out, spending time. There's a real growth, there's a real
Hmm.
thickening. So yes, I think the leadership in the Gulf recognize that there's this chasm between security and economics, and given where these visions in particular sit and lie, their future is in stability, and it's in economics, and it's certainly towards Asia. So I think what we're seeing is a knitting together of those interests. It's not necessarily big, it's not glamorous, it doesn't get the headlines in the same way. But if one lifts up the bonnet, you can really see a lot of EV work going on there.
Neil, is there a massive emission of hubris at the moment in that part of the world, in a sense that there are all these announcements, East-West pipeline, a new DP world outside of the mouth of Strait of Hormuz. And I was looking at the map and saying Jebel Ali has this much of stand and space, and Fujairah this much. And isn't there a sense of, we pour capital and we bypass Iran? And there is an assumption that you can de-risk Iran while Iran remains contained. Is there a bit of a naivety there? Because if this conflict is protracted, and even if Iran is a failed state, let's assume, there is no reason, as we discussed in Durham a few weeks ago, that Iran cannot put up an insurgency for another 10, 15, 20 years and project all of that on Strait of Hormuz. And the GCC, assuming that they can really bypass Strait of Hormuz, is not a real sense of understanding the urgency of the détente and coexistence. No matter how many patriots will come in the next 4 or 5 years, there is nothing to be going around at the moment. But where is this, in your opinion, fitting into this puzzle?
I mean, I think there's a lot of noise at the moment, and it's hard. The noise is deafening. Definitely, we're seeing a lot of hubris, as you've described it, around all of these potential corridors, and setting them up, and circumventing Hormuz. At the same time, a lot of things that I'm hearing, again, certainly from amongst officials in Gulf Arab states, is they clearly recognize that Iran is a neighbor. It's not going away. That term prisoner of geography, you hear that a lot, and we have to work with Iran. We have to find a means. So the noise sort of oscillates between those two positions, and I think that's probably reflective of maybe the panic that all Gulf leaders are feeling at the moment. Is how do we manage this? Is this this has now become structural. The fact that Hormuz has been closed, and we're this far into the conflict and it's still effectively closed. This can happen at any time. So yes, structurally we need to find a way around it. But I don't know. I haven't counted all the different corridor projects, but there are probably 15 or 20 out there. And there's a lot of excitement about Syria becoming this new hub. And it's a very attractive idea, and there's a certain romance to it as well, and with the Hejaz railway there's all this, but these are very long-term projects. We know from looking at these ideas that they're often around for 10, 20 years. Nothing happens, or very little happens, and then they either they die on the vine. So I think a lot of it is wanting to feel that there are alternatives, wanting to vocalize that, one, to send a message to Iran, but two, to send a message to their own constituencies, their own populations, because the sense that there has been this key vulnerability in the region for a very long time. I mean, I had an undergraduate ask me a couple of weeks ago, didn't they realize if Hormuz was closed, this would happen? It's like, well, yes, they did, but so there has to be an explanation, and I think this articulation of all these different projects is there, but clearly, none of them are costed. None of them are designed. None of them are planned. These are all ideas. Yes. Yes, the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia, they can build up that capacity. Actually, if they had the Chinese come in and do that, they could do that in a very short space of time. If it were anywhere else, it would take longer to do it. But that doesn't circumvent Hormuz. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of hubris at the moment, but also a lot of real thinking as how do we manage our relationship with Iran? How do we build that out and build something constructive and something that the Americans are going to have to live with?
Yeah, absolutely. That's going to be, I think, the nut they need to crack. And from what President Trump was saying yesterday, from Iranians being these amazing pals, good people, to I hate them, they're horrible people. How these leaderships who meet Iranians more or less on a regular basis are having to navigate, this oscillation is a problem in itself for them, I think, in terms of protocol and relationships. With the Chinese, you never get that because the Chinese are so focused on the interpersonal connections that leads then to understanding and so on. But given that none of these networks, pathways are going to see the light of day, but the one which is there is BRI, and the UAE set itself up as the entry hub of BRI into West Asia, and then from there into Africa even, and into Europe. And the shenanigans over the Strait of Hormuz, Neil, means that basically, the UAE's strategy of linking itself to China's growth strategy into Western Europe is now in abeyance. But that also hurts Iran itself, of course, which also wanted to play this BRI role. So for the Chinese, it was all right for a while that, yeah, we can build economic relations with UAE while Iran is isolated and is not causing any trouble for anybody. They're a pal, there's nothing to worry about. But that relationship is now so completely been disrupted. Where would the Chinese put their eggs now? Because obviously Iranian situation is far too problematic for them. But they also invested in this idea of, Dubai becoming this BRI hub, right? As you know, billions has gone into this relationship, and all of it seems to be frozen. And I don't hear the Chinese coming up with any constructive messaging to get themselves out of this hole. Even less so than the Americans. The Americans have got bad strategy. From where I sit, the Chinese seem to have absolutely no strategy in how to get themselves out of this. How do you read this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the same. I mean, there's nothing. I mean, I can't see a strategy. It just feels as though they've just down tools and they're just watching and scratching their head and sort of trying to figure out how. I mean, they've always been. You're right. I mean, they've always been comfortable with managing their relations with Iran and Saudi and the Emiratis, and that's what they've always seen. And obviously they brokered the sort of reconciliation between Riyadh and Tehran. So they've seen themselves as being able to play that. But for the time being, this just seems I think they're just sitting on the sidelines, just waiting, watching, and I guess they will develop a strategy, but it's not clear how quickly that's going to come forth. I'm always struck though by the UAE, because the UAE, I'm quite often asked in different fora, is MBS a strategic player or is he tactical? And clearly he's a strategic player, and he's sort of set out his stall a long time ago, and is, as I see it, he's waiting for China to come at some point, whatever, whether that's in 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years time. He's still convinced that's something that's going to come, and the UAE is present. It has a string of pearls of ports throughout the Red Sea for that access down to down to Africa, and also with sort of the E2 U2 I2, sorry. I mean, that was part of the I want to say U2 because of the band. That was part of the route into Europe. So very strategic, but yeah, for the time being, it's not really clear where China sits on this. But I think it's a patient player. I think it's just sitting there rather than just coming out with an announcement. I think it's just sitting and waiting to see how this is going to play out.
But how much of what has taken place, both of you, even Anoush, associate to China's efforts, this Pakistan track and the discussions in Islamabad? So has China been really absent, or is China doing, I don't know, an amplified hush-hush diplomacy, as we were talking about Oman, the quiet diplomacy? That is something I wanted to just nudge in. And I also have a question for you, Neil. Carry on. Why don't you answer that, and then I ask you my question. So is China really absent, or is China doing it its own way rather than, I don't think it can be indifferent to what's happening in the GCC, given its energy calculus?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, it's not a posture that's easy to see or define, but certainly, I mean, the role that Pakistan is playing in this, and it's, where did that come from? I mean, it's suddenly elevated almost from nowhere, and now you see. I think I referred to this, in Durham, the kind of step arrangement: Saudi, Turkey, Egypt, and Pakistan. It's a grouping. That's probably the best way of referring to that. And certainly, Pakistan has inserted itself into this, or managed to find a way into playing an important media. Yes, and it's definitely, there's a backstop to China, most definitely, and I'm sure that's that's probably sort of a backdoor entry or a way into this, just influencing more from behind the scenes than pushing out something very, very strongly. And my understanding of this step arrangement as well is, or I think I told you that I'd heard it also called PEST from another country in the region, just playing with the acronym. But anyway, it's very telling that you have Saudi and you have Turkey and you have Pakistan. Egypt's important, but and then with the China backstop on there. But with Pakistan and its relations, Turkey with its relations with Iran, this creates some kind of bridge that can be there. So yes, maybe, I mean, Anoush may know more on that one on the China side, but certainly it's not something that's been articulated. But I've certainly heard that in conversations that Pakistan and China are very close on this.
It reminds me of the old laptops, and there was a sticker with saying "powered by Intel." I think, when you look at China, Pakistan, it says "powered by China." But I wanted to ask you a question, and that is, what if the real, strategic shock is not the temporary disruption in oil exports, but the permanent geopolitical restructuring of the region? And can, in that context, the GCC, with all of their ambitions and bravado of capital expenditure, digital runways, and AI and all of that, can they get that reputational premium ever be reversed with what has happened to them as destination for capital and relevance in future? Either way, with an Iran reintegrated, imagine Iran comes back on the grid, or with an Iran that is chaotic. Can that premium be reversed?
I mean, it's a good question, and I think there are plenty. I mean, to be honest, I think it's too early to really tell. That's not to get out of answering the question. And I think in the early days of this, we did see a lot of headlines in media outlets who are enjoying this. There was a sense of I was in Bonn a couple of weeks ago speaking at a roundtable, and I said I think there was a sense in some of the international media of sort of Schadenfreude. They were taking pleasure in the fact that these upstart states in the region that had aspiring middle powers that were punching above their weight were suddenly sort of taken down a peg or two. And I think a lot of that probably muddled thinking. Certainly, even amongst policymakers outside of the region. I mean, these are states that still have very important hydrocarbon assets. These are states that have very deep pockets. They have relatively small populations. They have managed to grow and extend their influence over a relatively short period of time. If this situation persists and Iran, if they do not manage to, we'll say, reconcile or reach an understanding with Iran, then I think it will be hard for them to recover the position where they were. I think it was this strange little place, a little kind of quiet, not quiet, but busy but safe oasis. I mean, you had wars in Iraq, you had wars in Syria, you got wars in Sudan, but somehow they're exempt from that. But now they're front and center, and unless some deal is reached, unless some of those kind of structural factors are addressed, I think it will be hard for them to recover their former position. That's not to write them off, and that's not to say that they won't continue to invest elsewhere in the world. I mean, the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Qataris have increased their investments in sort of LNG supply chain capacity in the US, so we're going to see them continuing along those lines. But in terms of attracting FDI, in terms of attracting capital, it will probably be it will definitely be harder.
Of course, for the footloose traveler, of course, being a hub, being a destination, and so on. I mean, I see Emirate advertising 50% discounts, and obviously there is good reason for that kind of problem. So getting down to the brass tacks of it, Neil, how much do you think the war since March is actually affecting their economies directly? I mean, some like Kuwait and Iraq are more or less isolated at that end of the Persian Gulf. And yeah, true, Saudi Arabia and Emirates have got a safety valve, but Qatar doesn't. Bahrain doesn't. Oman is weak. How are they coping with what is the impact first overall of the war on their economies? And how are they coping? Are they having to draw on strategic reserves financially and so on to keep going? Because as you know, Saudi Arabia's economy was already kind of beginning to limp a bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, you've picked out the right countries in terms of Kuwait, Qatar, and Iraq, but particularly Kuwait and Qatar. I mean, they're suffering massively. I mean, they're having to. I mean, their income stream has effectively dropped off, right? I mean, it's nothing. So yes, so those countries. I mean, they're lucky in that they have deep pockets, they have deep reserves, but most certainly they're digging into those reserves, and you can see that projects that were in the pipeline have been placed on hold. Um, their ambitions are being curtailed very quietly. There are cuts to the labor force. So you're starting. Well, we've been seeing that for a few months now. We're starting to see some of those measures really begin to cut, really begin to hurt. In terms of Saudi Arabia, I mean, so Saudi. I mean, technically, Saudi and Oman have come out okay. Oman's come out okay, given that it has other access points, but obviously it's been a target. It's been a target too. And yes, Saudi was already on a sort of sticky wicket before this, and you could see them already. I mean, they've been messaging out for a good 18 months that the mega projects are sort of slowing down or being reprioritized. I think they've used this occasion of the war to reconfigure where Vision 2030 is, to change the priorities of PIF, which they wanted to do anyway. So they've done that, but there are quite big job cuts, projects on hold. A lot of expatriates are being laid off and sent home, but it's not just that. A lot of the subsidies are being cut. So there are stresses and strains, and I think we're beginning to see signs of this actually playing through to the population. When I was in Riyadh about 6 weeks ago, I alluded to this in Durham, but I think it's important to say it. When I was in Riyadh, there was a whole discussion on social media where there were expressions of frustration from young Saudis that so many foreigners are holding highly paid jobs and positions within the kingdom, and why weren't Saudis holding onto those positions? Now that manifested itself across a number of industries, and it was quite stark, because the Saudis are very good or very effective at policing their social media. And there came this almost like a Twitter storm, or it wasn't just on Twitter or on X, it was on other social media outlets as well. And there were criticisms of not just foreign nationals running organizations, but there were criticisms of elite Western educated Saudis running organizations as well. And that's tapping onto an underlying sense of nationalism. And I was in the kingdom at the time, and it was very stark, this sentiment. And I spoke to a young woman that I used to work with, and she said, Neil, this is effectively like our Brexit issue. This is very divisive. We want to be running our country. We want to be running our own industries. We don't want to be the ones that are being laid off. So the impact is very real, Anoush. It's being felt by the average Saudi. It's not just a number in a spreadsheet.
Neil, you've seen the world from politics, business, geopolitics, all the dance of seven veils. And as they say, desperate times, demand desperate measures. United States is not fiscally doing wow. I mean, the deficit is ballooning. There are still murmurs in, parts of Congress, Senate that, oh, September 11th is still hot there. Do you see a scenario in which America, in this heat of the moment, as mercurial as Donald Trump is, to say, you know what, you're either with us or against us, full-fledged. You have to underwrite this long war with Iran, which puts them in a pickle. And otherwise, as crazy as that may sound, your sovereign wealth funds, your assets, I mean, poof, if Russia couldn't do anything for its $300 billion as a nuclear power, I'm going to freeze your dollars as well. I mean, how, and then, by the way, I'm keen to do some active denial systems, Venezuela model, and consolidate, the hierarchy and bring some efficiency into the monarchies in the region. So why don't we consolidate part of, two and two and bring all of your emirates into two players between UAE and between Saudi Arabia? So where are these undercurrents of re-engineering the format and the capture and loot of finances may lead to in these circumstances?
Um, I find that
An
scenario.
easy question for you then.
I find that scenario very difficult. I mean, it's very attractive as an idea, and I could see Donald Trump thinking that, but you would hope someone somewhere along the way would at least say, "Excuse me, Mr. President." I mean, they tend not to because he gets on his tweets, right? He says, "We're going to charge every vessel 20%," and then the whole world says, "Well, that's completely mad." And then 12 hours later, he has to say, "Okay, I'm not going to do it." So I could imagine him sort of thinking about that and articulating it, but I could not imagine that coming into fruition in any meaningful sense.
So you're saying categorically there is no chance that America blocks some of the foreign assets and reserves of some of the GCC players for, rear mirror view, slap on the hand or anything. You don't see that.
I don't see that. I don't see that. I mean, I think that I could see him, for example, coming out with a statement like that for Europe and then walking it back. But I think he and his family value the relationships with those Gulf leaders. He is very transactional, but he recognizes that his own family interests are served by staying close to them. I mean, we saw Netanyahu, sit in the Oval Office squirming and having to apologize to the Qatari Emir. I mean, these Oval Office episodes are excruciating and painful. But he realized, I think, that Israel can't strike Doha. This was an overreach. It was never clear whether he gave some authorization, but certainly publicly, certainly in terms of his relationship with the Gulf leaders, that was a step too far. So I wouldn't see him as making a threat like that, because ultimately it's not going to serve his own immediate and his family interests.
Let me twist Ali's dark thoughts in a different way, Neil. And he's shown in recent past that he will cajole countries to do things that they don't want to and try and get away with it. For example, Venezuela, thou shalt cut all your ties with Iran and China, and I'll dictate that your oil comes through me. So something as drastic as that he can do because he's basically upended the regime in Venezuela. But in the Gulf, as you rightly say, he doesn't have that kind of, persuasion. But there are all these horse whisperers who want him to force the Saudis to cut a deal with Israel in the course of this, that this crisis is the opportunity, whether it's Kushner or others, that they see this as an opportunity. Israelis certainly see this as an opportunity to get the jewel in the crown of the Arab world, basically, sewn up. And, you and I know that the Saudis will resist it to the last breath. But given the vulnerabilities that you've said in terms of the security dependence on the US now and going forward, if Trump is persuaded that the way to get these guys on board, as the Marathis have drawn closer to Israel, is to then press the Saudis to do the same, or else, where do you think the Saudis will then put their chips?
Yeah, I mean it's a great question, and it's 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 a hard one to answer. I mean, because instinctively, and from what I know of the Saudis, and as you said, I mean, they would have to be dragged kicking and screaming to normalize. I mean, normalization was, was something that was on the cards, but after October the 7th, and then everything ever since, I mean, they just seem so far and distant. And again, I remember being in a workshop, I think about 2 months ago, and we had a senior Saudi interlocutor there, and at the end, that that interlocutor said, "I want to congratulate you all. None of you have asked me about normalization this time. You've understood it's not on the table. It's not on the card." But yes, I mean, for Donald Trump, I mean, amidst all this chaos and this madness, I mean, he will want to claim a victory at the end of this. He's got the Abraham Accords first time around. He sees the Board of Peace. I mean, we probably dispute that and disagree with that, but he sees that as being highly effective. And if he could deliver Saudi Arabia, that, with great force and great persuasion, that would go a long way to sort of cementing his legacy, and that would be a tremendous legacy. I'm just trying to think what he could do to threaten them, basically. What is strong enough to threaten, to persuade, to cajole? And it would have to be something. It would have to be something like, we are no longer going to provide, guarantee your security. There are already questions around that and what security guarantees look like. But if that in itself is called into question, that that could conceivably be a lever that they could push. I hadn't really thought about that, to be honest, until you've asked the question, because I've always just thought, no, they're going to resist. They're going to resist. But that would be, that's their Achilles heel, particularly given where the region is at the moment. So it's conceivable. I'm changing my opinion. It's conceivable that if he were constant enough, if he applied consistency in pursuing this, he may be able to just push them and just get them over the line. But Donald Trump seems to change his mind quite frequently. We've seen the different ways, as you said earlier, how he's described, the Iranian leadership on these are great guys. He was saying, I really want to meet Mustafa at some point. I mean, and then on the other side, these are devils or whatever. So his big thing is that there's no consistency there. So ultimately the sides would think, okay, let's wait for this hissy fit to go. In 24 hours, he's going to change his mind. But it's a really interesting point to press, and you could see someone telling him this idea. Saudi is still ripe. Israel still thinks, the Israelis still think this is the moment. They really do. So based on that, I could see him pushing for it, but he wouldn't have the constancy to see it through.
Neil, I've written 3 pieces in the past few weeks, and I posit that America is somewhat reconsidering the whole CENTCOM command. And I have come up with this mad idea that America and Israel are giving birth to a MEDCOM, a Mediterranean command. And the reason I bring that up is that then that changes the calculus of security significance of the GCC. Then they become cash providers rather than bases, because that architecture came under massive constraint in this war with Iran. And Saudi joining Abraham Accords doesn't make, in my humble opinion, the calculus from Tehran that much different, because UAE joined Abraham Accords as well. And that didn't change. It became, in the eyes of Iranians and across Persian Gulf calculus, a liability rather than an asset. So that's one side, but let's leave that thought aside, because I felt I really see shaping a MEDCOM, and I will send you a link to take a look at my madness there. Global Development Initiative, Global Governance Initiative, and various initiatives that China is coming up. America at the moment seems to be busy with Global Chaos Initiative, whether it's with NATO, whether it's with Greenland, etc. When you talk about economics in the GCC, when do you see a breakaway from the peg and the social contract and the currency dynamics? Because this as well is not going to be sustainable for too long if the oil revenue is not going out. So do you see fractures in the currency scaffolding as well or not?
I mean, certainly there are quiet conversations taking place around that. And it's an issue that has been raising its head every couple of years. My sort of instinctive response is it's still early days to break away from the peg. I think that I don't think there would be sufficient confidence amongst the Gulf states to undertake that right now. It is part of a direction of travel over the longer term, but I still think we're in early days around that. So I don't see a break.
Short and sweet. I can tell you, Nida, that's one of Ali's hobby horses. So I'm glad you put it to rest once, once, once and for all. It's an ongoing debate within our BRI dialogues, as you may have noticed from previous episodes.
Yeah.
My last, I mean, we want to talk with you, indefinitely, but given that, time and space are limited still, one last query would be, again, focusing on Saudi Arabia, where they all seem to have a kind of, post hydrocarbon asset development plans and so on. Do you think this war is shifting the dial on accelerating these, or when they hear, people in London shouting about opening up oil and gas fields in the North Sea, which to me makes absolutely no sense. But nevertheless, when they hear kind of elite forces in UK saying that, does it then reinforce their thoughts about, well, if those guys up in the North Sea think that this thing is still a runner, why do we need to diversify? Why don't we double down on our hydrocarbon assets, see the war through, because the world is going to be even more desperate for this stuff than they've been thus far. Which side do you think the balance is on the debates for renewables versus keeping the cheap stuff going for as long as we can?
So that was a question that came up during the Carbon Institute panel that I chaired, Anoush, a couple of weeks ago, and I think the answer is they want both. They want to be greedy. They are sufficiently invested now in clean energies. They're investing massively in the renewable space. I mean, Saudi Arabia has brought on a tremendous amount of renewable energy over the past few years. It's on target. Certainly the Saudis and the Emiratis, they have sort of vaguely state-owned enterprises that are operating. I mean, Aquapower, for example, Saudi Aquapower is operating in 13 countries. So they have invested massively in this space. They're not going to walk away from that. They do see that as a long-term future. However, what they do see as well, and you see that from the Emiratis, obviously, leaving OPEC, they do have this hydrocarbon asset in the ground, and they do not want to be writing that off. They want to get that out. They want to monetize that as best as they can, as quickly as they can, in fact, because there is a sense now that this is going to give a fillip, to renewables, to alternatives. And so there's a tightening time frame. So they're going to want to accelerate their way. But of course, I mean, for the Saudis in particular, they are investing. They do want to make decarbonization work because that extends the shelf life of oil in particular. So we're likely to see it's not about investment into that, because it's just making that commercial. they're struggling to make those operations commercial. So they want their cake and eat it, to be very blunt, to be very direct on that. I think subjects like hydrogen will be put on the back burner because that's costly. There are still no major off-takers for the time being. So monetizing those hydrocarbons, working out on those renewables. And the thing is the more renewables they deploy in the country, of course, the more hydrocarbons they have for export, and that's where they get their value. So it's a race against the time, a race against the clock. And the Emiratis, by leaving, OPEC, are really sort of stealing ahead of that. And you're going to see the Saudis coming soon right behind them.
Neil, thank you very much. You talked about race against time and the clock, and I have something to share with you and with our audience. About 4 years ago, I approached Anoush, and as many of you know him as Professor Ehteshami, and with a simple proposition. And I said, Anoush, I think the world deserves an impartial and insightful and impactful dialogue around the rise of China. And he was so receptive, so generous as he is. And the BRI Dialogues were born out of that conviction in many ways, 4 years ago. Our mission then was to, what are we going to take to our audience? Whom are we going to invite? Today, we have 62 episodes, dialogues, and with your good self as the guest of the day. And we said, let's define how the world can cope with China. And COPE was COPE, as complexities of China, the opportunities that China presents, the power and the externalities, and a framework to navigate this, rise and how to capitalize on it. Now, 4 years. And in that time, as you may know, Boris Johnson was the prime minister. Then it was Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer. And by tomorrow, when we publish this episode, Neil, we've had 5 prime ministers in 4 years. So one could argue that Anoush and I have been the only pair of steady hands throughout. And we don't take that lightly. So we wanted to thank our guests, some of our brilliant minds who've been on our program in their own fields, experts, audience, the team at Al Sabah program at Durham University, everybody who's tuned in, the fans, and what has turned out of BRI Dialogues in the past 4 years. Without it, it would be just a conversation, but it turned into a community. Anoush will be retiring in September, the loss of his students and the school, in my opinion. And this program, in this context, may not prolong and continue. It takes 2 to tango. If my partner is not there, who am I going to tango with? So I want to thank everybody. And Neil, you've been our season finale guest. So we're delighted to end on a high note and a coda with you. So Anoush, I am most grateful for your spirit, for joining forces with me 4 years ago, for, enduring my madness in positing scenarios that some of them have come to play, I have to say. And I enjoyed the ride. I'm grateful to everybody in Durham, a city that I've come to develop a soft spot for. So thank you, everyone. More to come from me and Anoush. It doesn't mean that we're not going to do, maybe we're going to do salsa, not tango, in a different context. But I leave it at that. So thank you all.
Ali, thank you so much for your kind words. Absolutely. It's been, we've also survived COVID, Ali, where we started in COVID, and now we've come the other side of it, and we did not cost the country $10 billion of wasted material. I think we were much more cost effective and hopefully more productive than the Johnson government was in that deep, deep crisis that we all faced in the world, that also in the UK. But I agree with you, it's been a fantastic ride, and we're going to carry on. I may not be the Al Sabah chair here any longer, but I remain an emeritus professor and carry on doing what I've been doing. I've always told friends and students that if they knew I enjoyed this so much, they would stop paying me. But thank God that they didn't stop paying me. So this is more. It's more than a job. It's more than a hobby. It's a pleasure. So, and it's rather fitting to have Dr. Neil Quilliam as our season end, because, as you noted earlier, Neil and I go back a very long way, and 30 plus years. In those days, I too had hair, But I'm glad to see that Neil has, and to have seen him develop in so many productive different ways has been really fruitful. And then to share him with us today, to hear his insight, it's been absolutely wonderful. He walks in many different forums and communities, but yet he remains true to himself, true to power, and so analytically insightful that it's great to have him as a former student and a colleague and friend now. So Neil, we are really grateful to you for having been our guest on 60 plus BRI Dialogues. And as Ali says, when this goes out, we'll be in a new regime here. But let's hope that this war, this madness, as you call it, can also come to a halt for the benefit of the region, but also this region has never sat in isolation of the rest of the world, that actually we can put the rest of the world at ease at the same time. So much obliged to you both.
Thank you. Neil, have a lovely day and thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.